Good morning, and welcome to this webinar from the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Nat Malkus. I'm the Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI and an affiliate of AEI's James Q. Wilson program in K-12 Education Studies. We're here today to talk about this webinar, aptly titled, Are China's International Test Scores Too Good to Be True? That's a good question, because China's PISA scores have been remarkably high, consistently placing the country at the near the top of the global rankings for years. In fact, Chinese students' mean math and science scores were over 100 points higher than the corresponding averages for OECD countries in 2018, suggesting they are 2 or more years ahead of their OECD peers in these fields. More recent results are similar. However, there's reason to question the reliability of these results. My colleague here at AEI, Nick Eberstadt, who's the Harry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI, explores this issue in his November report titled Knowledge and Skills in China's K-12 Population, an inquiry into the knowledge capital in the PRC. In this paper, Dr. Eberstadt and his co-authors, Patrick Norick, Radek Sabatka, and Peter Van Ness, analyze evidence on the knowledge, skills, and capabilities of China's K-12 students, and they conclude that their actual knowledge capital is much lower than advertised, potentially comparable to that of Turkey, which is below the average both for the United States and the OECD. In today's event, Dr. Eberstadt will take us through whether China's PISA test scores should be trusted due to issues like selective sampling, potential test manipulation, and a troubling lack of transparency. After Nick gives us an overview of his paper, we have a great panel with our distinguished guests. They include Harry Patrinos of the University of Arkansas and my AEI colleagues Mark Schneider and Derek Scissors. And we'll explore together the implications of the findings for Chinese students, the Chinese economy, and American competition with China. Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Nat, thank you so much for organizing this symposium that we have here. Derek, Harry, Mark, thank you for joining us. The origins of this study is a project on demography and the global balance of power. We had the not terribly visionary insight that we can go far beyond the headcount approach now, given all of the data that's available on the individuals that account for national populations. And ineluctably, this led us towards looking at the expansion of education around the world and its significance, in particular, the explosive increase in education in China, and to the question of quality of education and the quality of education in China. We began by trying to get a better sense of to try to map the terrain of knowledge and skills for the K through 12 population to begin with. Since there's a fair amount of international standardized testing on populations around the world, on youth populations around the world, there are problems with international standardized testing, but there's, in addition to noise, there's signal there. And so we wanted to see if we could compare the situation in China to the situation in other countries around the world. And as Nat mentioned, students in China are number one in test score results in maybe the leading international standardized global test that's used today in evaluations. So the PISA test maintained by the OECD. And China's students haven't just apparently knocked it out of the park in test score results. If you go by these numbers, they've like blown the park apart. As as Nat mentioned, they would appear to be a couple of years, the 15-year-old testees would appear to be a couple of years ahead of the OECD average. They also lead Singapore. In fact, Singapore is otherwise the top test-taking country in the world, rather small one, but they leave Singapore in the shade. And so we wanted to see if we could understand better what these test results mean and how they actually relate to the real existing population in China. Now, I always think that the most important statistical test is the laugh out loud test. And if you see some results that make you laugh out loud, you probably should look further into them. And the idea that a country which is very largely rural, which has very large pockets of population, kind of remote and not connected terribly well to Shanghai and Beijing, that this entire population would be outscoring Finland, Estonia, the poster children of educational performance by a huge margin. Makes you kind of wonder. So we started looking at the PISA test results, and there are a lot of actual problems for them. To begin with, the test organizers and test administrators specify that the latest tests are only covering 4 of China's 31 provinces, and you'll not be surprised to hear that these are some of the most developed of the provinces. You go a little further, though, and it's not really clear exactly who is being tested. And it's kind of impossible to find that out from either the PISA administrators or from the Ministry of Education in China. This is where anecdote becomes important. And so let me tell you a little anecdote about the test results from PISA for Shanghai, one of the areas that's being tested. A friend of a friend. I knew a guy who knew a guy who had a daughter who was, in fact, one of the 15-year-olds being tested in Shanghai. According to this lore, she was in maybe the top school in secondary school in Shanghai. She was in the top performing class within this secondary school. When her class was selected, everything shut down. For 6 weeks, the teachers taught to the test. The deputy mayor of Shanghai came in and lectured the class and told them how important it was for them to do well for the well-being of their nation, and advised them if their parents had any homework or other chores for them to tell them to get lost. This is a little bit different from the way that PISA tests are administered in, let's say, Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, by the way, the test scores for PISA do not radically change from one wave of PISA to another, whereas they do dramatically change over time from one wave of PISA to the next for China, always going up. So we have to keep in mind that one of the great traditions in China, and this may be one of the areas in education where China really is number one, is the tradition of test cheating and test beating. And this goes back all the way to the Song Dynasty and to the beginning of the imperial exams. China was the first country to really begin, printing and mass communication. And what was the first bestseller in Song China? The cheat sheet for the imperial exams. So it's not just the students, but there's a kind of a tradition of test beating. And if we don't mention that, if we are not cognizant of that, we can't really talk about China test performance in a sort of a comprehensive way. Uh, so the results are irreproducible for PISA China, and although in principle those tests cover a national population of about 185 million out of China's 1.4 billion, that leaves a fair amount of space. So we decided that we're going to try to see what other sorts of data or evidence were available for, the 80s, 85% of China that wasn't being covered by this. And there are some panel studies on education that we looked at, one administered by Renmin University, another by Peking University. They had less spectacular results, but there were also problems with replicability and transparency. I mean, it's kind of striking that in a country that has developed and is attempting to perfect a national surveillance state, that the administrators of these panel surveys seem to be extremely sensitive to privacy and didn't even want the users to know what provinces or what counties the young people being tested might come from. I guess for fear of replicability, I don't know. We looked at Gaokao tests, the college entrance exam that now over 80% of China's young people are taking, because higher education has gone from being an elite phenomenon to a kind of a inelegant Maoist word, massification sort of phenomenon in China. Those are also problematic to try to bridge, because there is a very clear kind of grading on a curve policy, so that less developed provinces are scored on a curve to seem to give those students a greater chance of going into some of the good schools. We had some ideas about how to bridge that, and needless to say, all of this suggested that the PISA numbers were dealing with the right end tail of the distribution, and maybe really with the hyped far far right end of the distribution. Scott Rozelle of Stanford and his colleagues have done some absolutely yeoman heroic work to kind of cast light on the rural hinterlands where so much of China's population lives, and where disproportionately so many children are born or being raised. Scott and his colleagues administered standardized international tests in reading in a number of provinces and rural areas. The results are absolutely devastating. They're consistently devastating. They were getting third world or low third world results back on these. They also did the very politically incorrect venture of administering cognitive tests. If you were in other parts of the educational sphere, as you all know better than I, you might get in a whole lot of trouble for this. But the cognitive tests that they administered in rural China consistently showed that rural children were a standard deviation below the international norms of these tests. This led Scott and colleagues to wonder or muse out loud whether a third of China's youth population might be suffering some sort of cognitive challenges. Needless to say, kids who've got severe cognitive challenges aren't going to be top test takers. At the end of the day, one of the questions about the PISA results is whether the PISA program will ever cover all of the provinces of China. At this point, I'm not sure that it looks as if it will. And you can kind of see why this would be. Let me give you the analogy of India. India began some years ago testing students in a few provinces, states, including a state where they had reason to think that the results might be rather favorable in Tamil Nadu in the south. Uh, the results came back and they were devastating. Um, they were very, very low by any sorts of international comparisons. Lant Pritchett of Oxford and Kennedy School has written about this, I think, with great acuity. Um, End of the day, India ditched the idea of coming up with a all India test of student achievement because it wasn't actually going to look that good. Now, the administrators of the PISA test will swear up and down on as many holy books as you wish to provide them that they have validated all of the data which they have collected for China, but it's not clear that it can go much further than where they've taken it, because I think there may be a lot of inconsistencies if you were to do an all-nation test. Now, where does this leave us? Harry Patrinos and his colleagues at the World Bank did this wonderful, innovative initiative of harmonized learning outcomes, where they attempted, more or less to come up with the equivalent of a sort of a GDP number for different countries around the world, matching up different internationally standardized tests that aren't exactly comparable, looking for bridges between them to come up with like an exchange rate between them. Um, and it's a really creative exercise. I know that some statisticians and people like Rick Hanishek have some questions about it, but when I look at their work, one of the things that Harry and colleagues came up with in their estimates was a calculation for China trying to include the rural hinterlands, some of the work that I mentioned by Scott Rozelle and colleagues about places that weren't tested by PISA. They came up with a hypothesis that all China levels of knowledge and skills for youth would be about, certainly weren't at PISA level, certainly weren't at OECD level, might be about at Turkey level, the country of Turkey. Turkey is Turkey is a pretty significant country. It's an advancing high middle income country in the World Bank's classification. It's an OECD member, actually. But it isn't Estonia, and it isn't Finland, and it certainly isn't Singapore. We ended up with a working hypothesis that Turkey, the working hypothesis, the null hypothesis, is disprove the hypothesis that China and Turkey are about on the same level. Now, if that is the case, this would mean a number of things. One of the things it would mean is that there's a very, very large population in China with basic skills. Rick Hanishek and his colleagues looked at all sorts of international tests and tried to estimate the proportion of young people with basic skills. In India, their result was kind of horrifying, that 88% of young people did not have basic skills including like, can you tell me what time it is by looking at a clock with hands on it rather than an analog or a digital. In China, we might have actually the largest population of young people with basic skills. And even if it's not Finland, this could be a very significant international economic building block for international development. Why don't I stop here? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick, for going over the careful paper and also one where you don't pull punches. So let's go to the panel and see some reaction. Harry, I'd like to start with you. As Nick mentioned, you've done a lot of work with the World Bank, a lot of work on international education. This idea of knowledge capital, I'm interested in how important that is and how well these tests actually gauge this. I mean, does your work sort of jibe with Nick's assertions on PISA, and how wide-ranging does that go on other assessments?
Yeah, thank you, Nat, and thank you, Nick, for the presentation and excellent paper. Before I answer your question, just to put this in the context, I firmly believe that measuring learning outcomes is important for many reasons, including the fact that we can monitor progress, we can see it's linked to development, especially economic growth. And I think having data not just on years of schooling, but also on learning outcomes, which are there's much more differentiation between countries on learning outcomes than there is on years of schooling, gives us a better sense of what contribution human capital or knowledge capital does for economic growth. But those learning outcome measures have to be based on real data from standardized assessments that are comparable and useful to the public, citizens, parents, and students. And what we did, and thanks for calling that out, Nick, we tried to go back to these assessments. We've been measuring learning outcomes for students since the 1960s. The US was one of the first countries and a consistent participant in all of these. But these international tests have seldom been used. When they are, it's usually just to rank countries or to brag about results or to chastise somebody about learning outcomes. And the owners of the various data sets claim that they're all unique and different. The truth is they're highly, highly correlated. How do we know that? Because many countries participate in multiple assessments, so we can actually measure how they do in one assessment and infer performance on others. And that way we can include more countries into the overall database. So using the microdata, we can control the various factors and make these data sets comparable. We can harmonize, in other words, so we have the harmonized learning outcomes. And that's what we did at the World Bank, as Nick said, but it wasn't the first attempt. Others have done this, including Rick Hanishek. We just had a different methodology and a much larger database. So it's not innovative, but it's comprehensive and transparent. Nothing unorthodox about it. Economists bring together different data sets all the time. What we have is a widely accepted data set, published in Nature, loads of citations already. And the team was World Bank led when I was there, but also non-World Bank experts from Yale, Oxford, London School of Economics. There are other assessments, compilations. Some of them are much larger than what we have. How are they larger? Massive imputation. We decided early on we would not impute scores. We wanted actual scores that we could reference and follow up. And when we were doing the index, of course, China and India, but we'll leave them aside for now, presented a big problem for us. The only data set we had then, as Nick writes very well in the paper, is PISA, and the scores are very high, too high. And why do we think they're too high? It was only one city at one time, Shanghai, and then 3 other provinces. So definitely not a representative sample. So we had to make an adjustment. And remember, we don't impute. So we had to look for data. We found Scott Rosel's papers. We found some other indications that the scores aren't as high, especially in the rural areas. And that's how we adjusted massively China's score from being number 1 in the world in PISA to something like 456 and then 441. These are much lower numbers than what PISA was publishing, what the OECD was publishing, but they're not awful scores, as Nick says. They're just more realistic. After all, developing areas of China are still rural. But it's important to have this indicator that's realistic, because then we can measure things like economic growth. And in the past, when economists used years of schooling, they found a correlation, but it wasn't very strong. when we and of course, using years of schooling, there's a causality issue because richer countries have more schooling. So is it which one comes first? But learning outcomes is not a reverse causality problem. You can't just because you're richer suddenly have better schools. So we think the learning outcomes is a better measure. And when we put this in our growth equations, whether they are regression models or development accounting, we find much larger and more significant impacts when it's learning outcomes that are being measured and not years of schooling. So it does show that there is a definite link between human capital or knowledge capital and economic growth, and therefore to development. And after all, we know now that much of the success countries have had in reducing poverty, raising incomes, has to do with education, and it should be education of quality and representative of the population. I'm not sure it's useful to have scores for select areas other than for doing an Olympiad of schooling. But if you really want to measure outcomes and target your investments, which I'm sure governments around the world are doing, they may not all participate in PISA, but we do need those learning outcomes. Otherwise, it doesn't become a serious exercise. I also agree with the paper that even with these much lower scores, China still has, I think what it says in the paper, by far the largest pool of high achievement pupils of any country on earth. That's by definition true because of the size of the country. And the other thing to say about China, the educational expansion has been massive. In preparing for this, I looked at the numbers. In the 1970s, the returns to education were about 2%. By 2010, it had risen to 10%, which is the global average. At the same time, schooling went from just 4 years to 8 years. So in one generation, they changed all of this. All this goes back to the end of the Cultural Revolution, 1976, and then the compulsory schooling laws in the 80s and the economic reforms that they had. So even if only a few regions or provinces or cities like Shanghai, which has a population of 25 million, are the only high scoring ones, still worthwhile to look at what they're doing. After all, we're in a global learning crisis. We were in a global learning crisis before the pandemic. It's even worse now. So we still need some examples of where countries are participating. My last message is, sorry to end on a pessimistic note, I worry about measurement. I worry about the same things Nick worries about, but also too few countries are participating in standardized assessments. It's not useful for their policy making. It's not useful for their students and populations. And some countries did drop out of international assessments, some because of school closures, yet Ukraine managed to implement PISA during a war. So I do worry about the non-participation of countries and moving away from measurement. But thank you for inviting me.
Harry, quick follow-up here. You mentioned India, and I don't want to go chapter and verse, but the challenges Nick talked about for China shouldn't necessarily only be manipulated in China. It could be other countries. Is China sort of, by your estimation, the grossest offender here, or are there many countries that maybe game the system a bit?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Many countries have entered PISA or TIMSS slowly, right? So Dubai came in, and then years later, the rest of the United Arab Emirates came in. I think other countries have done that as well. And I think what we hoped when China came in as Shanghai, then a few provinces, is that over time there'd be more provinces, and hopefully at some point it would be the whole country. But I don't see that happening. And with China not participating in the latest round of PISA, I don't see much progress in that. So that's one kind of manipulation. But I usually tend to think that maybe they're doing this to test the waters before they go in all the way, which is fine, as long as they have a plan to go in. I do think that some countries take it very seriously and prepare their students. They might not be cheating per se, but preparing people to take, multiple choice exams. In some countries, they don't have these. So they do need some testing on that or preparation. That part is okay. Some countries do stress things like, make sure you're coming to do the test. Others don't care, right? We have countries that no matter what they even when they're offered rewards to schools participation, they don't get a big enough sample to even be counted. So it's very different around the world. As long as the conditions are the same for the assessment, I think I've not seen anything for China or India where there's been questions about the actual test. Representation is another matter, but the actual test has been done well. And these agencies that run TIMSS or PISA have been very good at detecting any anomalies in data and appropriately footnoting those on the table.
Derek, scissors. I want to ask you, and I want to just quote briefly from Nick's report. He writes, the regime in China apparently has no great incentive to illuminate the contours of knowledge and skills for its rising generation, but some considerable motivation to cloak or obscure those realities. To you, what are the incentives that China has to play games with PISA results? Is it just propaganda, or is there something else motivating Chinese officials?
Well, I'm going to reverse and actually answer your question first and then wander off into other territory. Look, there is a powerful, I'm going to talk about the disincentive, but there is a powerful incentive, which is you're supposed to be making rural China better. And clearly, so my first visit to China was more than 30 years ago. If you visit urban China, it's better. But most people don't visit rural China, and they didn't visit rural China in the 80s or 90s. And if you do visit rural China, if you're allowed to, you will feel like, okay, urban China is, or some cities in urban China are like developed country cities, and some cities in urban China are not far behind. And then rural China looks like it's got, it's either the 1930s or it's the 1880s in a lot of places. And so that's just politically unpalatable regime. They just, they do this every year, but they have another plan to revitalize rural China. I mean, how many decades can you be revitalizing something? That there is a powerful disincentive to just pretend that everything, since there's progress in some parts of the country, there is progress in other parts of the country, and it is an important political failure. Communist Party of China is a rural party. It's not the Soviet Party. It was founded on raising up the peasants. And we won't get into the checkered history of how that worked out, but it is a big deal. There are still no private rural land rights because that goes against the grain of the party. And it's also the biggest constraint on Chinese economic development. They just don't, it's inconceivable to admit that after all these decades and all this progress in certain parts of urban China and some progress in all of urban China, that rural China can be this far behind. And so that's where you get the falsification. Now, there is this problem. Nick says the laugh out loud test. I do the implication test. I'm fine. Make your crazy claim. What's the implication? You started at the beginning, Nat, saying that Chinese test scores have been high for a long time, and they're getting higher. Well, why is the economy getting weaker? Our economic performance is deteriorating. If you want to, Nick could be right. And others, not just Nick, Harry and others could be right that the scores are false. But if the scores are true, what the hell else are you doing that is so wrong that you are ruining this improving education level and getting a completely debt-driven, economy? So I'm happy to say, okay, great, your education is marvelous. Then who's responsible for this? And that's the real, I think Nick is and Harry and others are at least, and Scott are at least partly right. But if they were wrong, we have this conundrum of why is Chinese economic policy so bad? And that gets, that brings us, that's the link between this discussion and a lot of current Chinese policy discussions, where you have people saying, what China really needs to do is borrow more money. No, that's not what it needs to do. That is an extremely strong correlation with deteriorating economic performance. That we could talk about their attitudes towards innovation. Demography is obvious. I mentioned land. There are a lot of explanations that don't require education. But in any case, if it's either the education is not performing the way it should, or it is performing the way it should, which is unlikely, and failing to translate, we have a crippling decades-long, at this point, problem in China's development model. And it's going to lead them to never reach upper income, even using GDP per capita. By the way, Chinese personal income is 45% of their GDP per capita. So that's a strange discrepancy to try to deal with. And, that has, I'll stop here, but if China is never going to be the economy that some people think it already is, and have thought so for a long time, it's never going to reach that level. It's never going to be a peer economic challenger to the United States. That has very important international implications. It's not the end of the story, but it's a start. So either we have education being wrongly portrayed, or we have colossal economic mistakes that offset the effects of this education miracle, or some combination of the two, which is more likely. And in either case, we have to, try to get some sort of explanation for why China's economic performance has deteriorated. And since we don't, since the government does not acknowledge this explanation, we have no reason to think that economic performance will improve. And what's being discussed is trivial compared to the extent of the problems, whether they're located in human capital or physical capital.
Mark Schneider, former director of IES, you've had a unique view into testing and how the sausage gets made. Many might see the PISA program as a product of OECD, a well-oiled education measurement machine of diplomacy, free of infighting and politics. Is that a fair assessment? I mean, how do the international and internal
Matt,
politics play out in PISA?
Right. Whoever said that this is a well-oiled machine? So look, I mean, just to put this in perspective. So people here have done a lot more empirical work about the economic development and the test scores. So I sat in the middle of this machine for years. I was on the PISA governing board. So remember, PISA is a activity of the OECD. But like many of the programs in the Education Directorate, it has its own governing board. So there's something called the PISA Governing Board, which all OECD members have a seat. And then in the last round of PISA, there were more countries that were partners, 44, than there are OECD countries. So when the PGB meets, theoretically the OECD countries are driving this, but there are many, many people sitting around the table that are partners and not OECD country. That's number one. Number two, I think everybody realizes that the PISA scores are and I'm going to object to the way in which people are talking about Chinese PISA scores, because you say that in one breath, and that you started by talking about China's scores, and then the other breath we're talking about how this doesn't reflect China at all. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the history of China's involvement in PISA and OECD's rather mercenary approach to PISA. And in fact, as several people noted, OECD is bent over backwards to allow China leeway in sampling and testing that other countries have not been afforded. I think the growing anti-Chinese sentiment is going to manifest sooner or later in PISA. So remember, in 2022, the Chinese schools were closed, so they did not. There's no China score. The provinces didn't participate. But in 26, when PISA goes back, 25 or 26, we changed the periodicity from 3 to 4 years. So when the next PISA comes around, it's not clear what will happen there. That'll be up to the PGB to decide. So just a quick reminder. So in 2009, Shanghai was the only part of China that participated in PISA, and that's a highly selective. Someone mentioned that this is the richest city in province in China, and Shanghai outscored every other participant in reading, math, and science. And actually, some of you may have had children or grandchildren, and all of a sudden, Shanghai math started showing up in all kinds of places, right? In the next round of PISA in 2012, Shanghai was again the top performing country in all three subjects. Hong Kong was reported separately, as was Macau, and all three of them, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Macau, were all top performers. And they often outscored Japan and Korea. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. In 2015, the next round, Hong Kong and Macau were again tested separately and reported out separately. But again, this is where China comes into play, because 4 provinces were selected: Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Guangdong, BSJG as it's called. And they were no longer in the top 5, but they were in very respectable, often in the top 10 in math and science. And then in 2018, this is the clearest example of cooking the books, when Guangdong was dropped and Beijing was substituted. And the immediate effect was that China scores went all the way back, went back up. In 2022, the Chinese schools were closed, so they were not tested. They did not do PISA. So this has led to many commentaries about how fair and representative this rather unique sampling procedure is. And again, having sat through many OECD meetings about China, here are just my personal reflections. So someone mentioned this before. OECD had the entirely ludicrous statement that we could not do a national assessment of China because Chinese infrastructure was not developed enough to have a true national sample. And we're talking about one of the most authoritarian and intrusive countries on the entire planet. To say that they could not create a national sample was somewhat suspect, shall we say. In the PGB meetings, the interesting dynamic was how angry Japan and Korea were over the highly skewed sampling, because Japan and Korea have always been top performers, and there's obviously a lot of regional competition. And all of a sudden, now they were being bumped out of place by this highly skewed China sample. They were, given the nature of Japan and Korea, they were extremely polite in these meetings, not taking public stands, but I had many conversations with them, and they were really very, very upset. So I offered to bring Massachusetts and Minnesota to the next PISA governing board, because those 2 states have actually paid for state samples, and guess what? They did quite well. Right. I mean, they were in, at the very top of the league tables, not as high as Japan and Korea, but way better than the United States. So I offered that. And then I even said, well, education is a state's responsibility in the United States. So I'm going to bring 51 people, representatives from all the states and the District of Columbia. Obviously, that also did not go over well, but the fact of the matter is that the Chinese brought representatives from all all the provinces that were there. So there were a lot of Chinese representatives. They weren't able to vote on stuff, but they made their presence clear. So okay, so why did OECD bend over backwards to allow this? So as I say, in real estate, only 3 things matter: location, location, location. So for OECD, in terms of China, there are 3 reasons: money, money, and more money. So OECD gets fees from member countries. US pays about 20% of OECD budget. In things like PISA, we also pay about 20%. So there are fees for participating in PISA. Some of the fees are dependent on the size of the economy, and other fees that, like, there's a baseline. So, but here's the thing: OECD accepts voluntary contributions, VCs as they call, and voluntary contributions are free money, if you will, and they are OECD needs these things, these voluntary contributions, so that they could have a much better life, shall we say. And there are huge fights in OECD, not huge fights, but there are significant fights in the panels that I was involved in about whose VCs the OECD should take, and whether or not taking VCs from China, what does it violate? So in part, what happens when you end up pursuing VCs is that it becomes a tail that wags the dog. There was also a psychological dimension to involving China and on very, what's the right word, lax terms, and it's the same process going to play out with other countries like India. So Andreas Schleicher, who's run PISA since the year 2000, and has been called the schoolmaster to the world, I don't believe there are many other people on this planet that could have pulled off PISA the way that he did. So I want to give him all the credit for that. But he wants to turn PISA into not an OECD test, but a worldwide test, right? So in 2022, there were more partner countries, 44, I've noted this before, than there were OECD countries that took PISA. And there are 37 OECD countries. But because so many of these partner countries are so far below even the lowest performing OECD countries, PISA has now designed a PISA for development. So the money incentive and the ego that we're going to be the worldwide test, I think, have driven a lot of the decision making with regard to China and allowing China to choose its provinces. And I think they just got away with too much. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I neglected to tell the audience we're going to do some audience Q&A in about 15 minutes. And for those who have questions, please send them in. You can email them to greg.fournier@aei.org, or you can tweet them at hashtag #ChinaPISA. Nick, we've had a long gulf since you've been able to respond. What do you make of these things? And I'm just curious to kick it off. You say some of the China results are laugh out loud. It seems like PISA would be concerned about the laughing out loud. The OECD officials running this, are they sensitive to these critiques?
My impression was that they're very sensitive to these critiques. I talked with Dr. Schleicher about this, and he was very forceful in insisting that they had validated and verified their results, that that the results in some sense were not surprising, since a poor country like a low-income country like Vietnam had performed very, very well. That the rural migrant children from so-called out of hukou, which is a huge issue in China, were being included in the urban testing in places like Shanghai, and that he is very confident about the results. So I don't think that I was the first person in the universe to raise questions. I think this was rather familiar ground when we went over this. I would make a comment about some of my previous homework on this and pose a question to Harry, because I think that the HLO work that he and his colleagues have done is really, really interesting work. In a previous bit of homework, my colleagues and I tried to use we might call developmental indicators to, quote, predict a country's HLO score. We'd use things like urbanization, just the income, mean coverage of schooling, and this was not work that I think would get us into the Journal of Political Economy. It was just kind of like basic stuff, but it suggested that something like that you would predict that a country with China's developmental specs would end up somewhere around the level of Turkey in an HLO. The big question being, in our view, we had regional dummy variables which increased things for some magical reason for East Asia and lowered it in other areas of the world. The big question was about cognitive for China. If China's cognitive was as high as it was being tested in urban areas, then you'd get an OECD level HLO for China. If it was lower than that nationally, it would be more like Turkey, as I said. But Harry, here's my question for you. I'm wondering if we have in the World Bank a dog that isn't barking. And I do not know my way about the World Bank. I can, barely find it when I take the metro in DC, much less, getting inside the building. But when you all came up with those indicative results for China on HLO, which, as I mentioned, around Kenya, around Mauritius, around Turkey, as I recall, were some of in the neighborhood of the estimates you all came up with. Did the executive director for China ever have anything to say about this? I could see how this might be a slightly awkward internally. Maybe executive directors just don't comment upon work that relates to their country, but did you ever get any sort of vibes from that office about the work that you all had done?
No, I never personally heard from the office of the Chinese executive director. We did hear from other executive directors, usually asking for clarifications. Countries typically worry if they're ranked, below their neighbors. Why are they below their neighbors? Usually we would explain the methodology, share the data. That was it. But I never heard from the Chinese ED. I don't know why or why not. Maybe I wasn't part of the conversation, but one hypothesis I have is that I do think officially they see their participation in PISA as experimental. Why do I say that? You discussed the NAIC, which is like the NAPE, but with a Q that I think China, based on the US's national report card, that they describe as experimental. It's not the whole country, and they say that they're just doing this to see if they can build capacity. So I think officially that is their view, and they probably thought. It's hard to believe that anyone would say that if I go to Massachusetts, that's the scores for the US. Why would you say that about Shanghai? You only, as Derek says, you only have to visit Shanghai in a rural area in China to know Shanghai is not representative of the country. Perhaps it never was. It's still interesting. They're still doing a lot of interesting educational programs, but I don't see why anyone would believe that. So I'm of the same opinion as you are, and Derek's point about if the scores are number one in the world, why isn't it a more developed country? Well, because the scores aren't as high as they say, because it's only part of the picture. The scores correspond very nicely with what Shanghai looks like. They don't correspond with the rest of the country. So I don't think that anyone, and I would dare say the EDs for China, the executive director of China, probably also had no objection because they know it was a test for four provinces.
Harry, let me follow up on that. There's certainly a sampling problem, but Nick's anecdote at the beginning that in China, these PISA tests are high stakes tests that, the local governing official comes in and prompts them. I don't think that's how the US students take PISA tests. And Mark, you can weigh in if they treat them like high stakes tests. Is that part of the equation different in China? Or is that anecdote not something that you think is wide ranging?
I do think that they place a lot more importance than countries like the US or the UK or Netherlands. But there are many other countries that place a lot of importance, and we hear They try to create conditions that will be favorable. They don't do very well because the students aren't scoring very well. So it's hard to move something to this level. So I do think that even though they may be raising the profile of the test, might lead to some higher scores. I doubt it pushes them to where they are. I think they do have these conditions. And the other test of this would be the universities. These same cities that participate in PISA have universities that are now ranking in the top 200. If you look at the universities, whatever ranking you like in higher education, we did it for all 4 of them. The number of Chinese universities entering these are astonishing. Europe has not changed the number in the top 200 in decades. China has completely changed that. So there is a definite high level of human capital in these provinces that are chosen to participate in PISA. So I have no doubt that the scores are more or less accurate for those tested areas. But like Nick, I don't believe that these are the scores for China.
Let me just go back to your question, Matt, about the way PISA is received in the U.S. and other countries. So there's only 165 high schools that are part of the PISA sample. And as long as I've been involved with this, the U.S. has had an incredibly hard time recruiting schools. It was the 19, so I was the director of IES. I was involved in high-level discussion in the Department of Education. We were falling behind in terms of recruiting the schools necessary to do the PISA test. And the call went out from the secretary, call every high school on this list. If you know anybody, call them and have them get them to participate in this. So that's number one. Number two, many of the smaller European countries take PISA as their national exam. So that is, you have to keep that in mind. So that's high stakes. In the US, it's pretty much no stakes. And that really does matter.
Nat, can I ask a provocative question?
Provoke away.
All right, so this is for Nick and Harry, I think, but I'm happy to hear from Mark too. Okay, China has a high level of basic skills in most of the country. It has a group of people with high human capital, which are the ones who get tested, and then they just, present that as a national average. That looks like a pretty good true education profile. Certainly it looks really good if it's scale. They have the biggest group of basic skills. They have the biggest group of high skills in absolute size. And yet the economy is deteriorating. Because I don't focus on education and human capital, would like to just dismiss all of your work now. Okay, thank you. I got it. This is the corrected education profile. I appreciate it. It doesn't matter anymore. Let's go find the real reason for Chinese economic deterioration. Can you push back against that? Because I don't doubt any of you for a second. I've been working on falsified Chinese economic statistics for 35 years. So I'm taking as read the characterization you are given. That's not the challenge. The challenge is, if I take as read the characterization you are given, China looks to me like it's in a pretty good human capital position, and it should be improving over time. Not the one they say, but nonetheless a pretty good one. But their economic performance has gotten worse. So I get to locate my explanation elsewhere. Thank you, education people. Goodbye. Am I wrong?
Well, Derek, could I just jump in there? So the U.S. is always in the middle of the league table, right? And we go up a couple of countries, we go down a couple of countries, a couple of points, a couple of down. We're always behind Germany, for example, Japan, Korea. But to your point, no matter that we're mediocre in PISA, we've left every one of these countries in the dust in terms of economic development. And the gap. So if you go back to the mid-1970s, all the OECD countries, the EU, Germany, France, UK, US, were all like tightly clustered. And now in terms of GDP per capita and adjusted for PPP, and the fact of the matter is that we have left all these countries in the dust. So PISA is like, so PISA the thing, especially among education people, but it's certainly not predictive of economic growth and development.
Let it be said that Mark completely agreed with my point, and we'll move on from there. Yeah.
But just to follow up, I think it depends on the time frame. I think if we look at post-cultural revolution to the 21st century, education, human capital had a huge role to play in reducing poverty and raising income levels in China. Since the, I don't know, 2010 or so, things have changed, and I think other factors come in. So the high-level human capital, is it being used the way it is, say, in the United States? And I think then factors like the polity and the ability to organize economic activities freely probably plays a bigger role than in those initial stages when having literacy makes a big impact. The other point about scaling, I think they are scaling. It's kind of slow, but take Shanghai, rural areas of Shanghai. There are rural areas of the province are much less developed than the urban areas. They are sharing educational practices with rural areas, and randomized trials run by U.S. researchers have shown that they're able to make up a large part of the gap. So they are scaling these things. I think they still have, even with those high scores or Turkey level scores, it's still a population with a schooling level that's much lower than, say, the United States. I think it's less than 10 years schooling compared to the U.S., which is much above 12. So there's still room to scale, I think, but they do have to solve the polity issue if they do want to have a much more sustained innovation-led growth model.
Nick?
Derek, I'll take a crack at this also. I mean, one obvious point is that we're testing the future workforce, not the current workforce in China. Second is that if you take a look at, say, Hanashek et al.'s estimates of youth with basic skills, proportion of basic skills, it does track with national economic performance, and that way you can look at it. It's like a richer country can buy more skills than their kids. I mean, if you put it oversimplistically. But more to the immediate point, in some previous work I did in this same project, I was able to show, at least to my own satisfaction, that national economic performance in the future can be estimated tolerably well by human resources on the one hand and business climate as measured on the other. I mean, how do you measure business climate? It's obviously somewhat subjective as opposed to more objective measures of human resources. But so I found that, depending upon where you were on the index of economic freedom or on the Freedom in the World index, you could get a 100% or 200% variation for a country that had a really awful measure for quality of institutions and policies, with the same, holding human resources constant. So I'm not surprised that China could be humongously underperforming given its quality of economic policies and institutions. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking at the quality of policies and institutions, because those might be the real thing that could be variable. You may tell me that those are constant and immovable, and I should be looking at the human resources instead.
No, actually, the fact, I won't take up any more time, but Harry mentioned since 2010. Of course, what happens in 2009 is the Chinese leverage themselves to the hilt. They go from a low debt country very quickly to a high debt country. They've never gotten off that path. They now have channels where they just blow tons of money. And you can, long story short, increasing levels of human capital, you're generating more wealth, and the state is saying, thanks, we're going to throw it away. They don't actually think they're throwing it away, but from the standpoint of economic performance, they are throwing it away. So it makes perfect sense that there was a decline in policy quality at the institutional level, not short term, starting right when Harry says, "Hey, education doesn't seem to be explaining as much as it used to."
So we have some questions coming in from the audience, and I'll pose a couple of these. This one's sort of general, maybe Nick, Harry, Mark. Are there other OECD countries reporting scores that seem too good to be true? That sort of maps a question I've written down here. Can we trust international scores? I mean, this raises major questions about China. Does it raise major question about PISA generally or TIMSS? Harry?
I don't think so. I'm quite impressed that the OECD and the IA that runs Pearls and Tim's are pretty stringent about the testing and looking at anomalies, and they do document this. And if you look at the participants in Teams Visa, sometimes a country's announced it's participating, they don't appear in the final report. What happened? No one's going to put that in the report, but usually there's some data, they'll call it a data anomaly or something like that. So it could be a sampling issue, but usually those do enter the report with an asterisk, but there are countries that are taken out. So I don't have a lot of concern about that. We do see countries that, have a high score one year, it's not high the next year. But if you look at our harmonized learning outcomes, we have several different data sets. So there is an attempt there to kind of smooth out those jagged edges, but based on actual test scores. So I think some of the scores that look too good to be true might be a sampling aberration in one year. But if it's obvious manipulation, I don't think it would appear in the final table.
Mark, Nick, anything to add?
No,
Mark, you go ahead, and then I've got a comment.
Yeah, no, I think that these, I mean, they're sampling experts, they're international contractors. It's a competitive process to get there. So I think that in general, this is the process is good. I think dropping off the league tables is something that's more common than Harry may be noting. In like the US has frequently gotten asterisks or square, right? Because we don't meet our sampling requirements. We are able to do non-response bias analysis, and some of that gets us back into the territory of, yes, we can report your scores, and there are all kinds of marks. So the UK has trouble getting its sample. The US, those are the two countries that most often run into problems, as far as I remember.
Mark and Harry have done the deep surgery on these data. I'm just a kind of a more superficial consumer. As a superficial consumer, I can tell you that when you look at not just the PISA, but the Pearls and the TIMSS data, you do, as Harry mentioned, from time to time get a kind of a twitch where there's a big variation from one wave to the next for a particular country. Those are outliers. That's happened seldom. You also get some outliers where the general correspondence between the three different data sets seems to be a little off for a country in a particular wave. But as I would mention, those are outliers, those are exceptions. Generally, you do not see that in the data.
So I just want to note one other thing. So PISA is really not that important in the US. Again, we have trouble even meeting our minimum quota. But there have been examples of countries that have done well in PISA and then have become heroes for some period of time. Finland, for example, was like oh my God, it was a star. And then like, I don't know how many people ended up doing, travel to Finland to see what was going on. And then 3 years later, the Finland miracle wasn't such a miracle after all. The biggest example is in 2000, the German PISA shock was really significant because Germany felt that they were like great, and then they ended up truly mediocre in PISA, and then they just like, oh, we need to correct that. We need to work on that. So that's the German PISA shock is still talked about. Estonia, you mentioned, Nick, several times. Estonia, one of my absolute favorite countries. I can't believe they're in one of the worst neighborhoods in the world, and they're actually they're taking everything about education and advanced electronics and tech is like they're taking it really seriously. The problem, of course, is Estonia is smaller than the Washington, D.C. metro area.
I have another question here. You knew AI had to come up in every webinar after 2024. Look, the person asked, Saul Khan is arguing that AI will dramatically change standardized testing, making current forms obsolete. Then they go down. If PISA changed to this kind of administration, would we anticipate major changes in results from nation to nation? And Mark, I'll add on, would that be a huge political rumbling in PISA, or is that part of the glide path forward?
So PISA, as you know, it fights all the time over the experimental part of the exam and the part that needs to be repeated over and over again. And these are really serious fights that go on. And some of it revolves around Andreas's vision of what the test should look like and the future of PISA. And many countries go along with it, and other countries say, no, stick to your knitting. We need to know about literacy, numeracy, and scientific literacy.
Could I mention something which is slightly outside of our purview, but related to AI? So I'm trying making a reach. If test beating and test cheating is as significant in the sinosphere, or at least the PRC sphere, as I suspect, AI may help to provide, kind of like a quality control. When I was in Taiwan earlier this month, I talked to an economist who's got a friend in Hong Kong. This is university, not K through 12. Was absolutely mystified because he's got these students with these fantastic resumes, and half of them are world beaters, and the other half with the same fantastic resumes can barely speak English. So there may be some scope for machine learning and AI and helping to separate the sheep from the goats in some of these testing, for at least for higher education.
Let me point out that any such correction will be figured out and reversed by the Chinese very quickly. So maybe as a worldwide phenomenon, fine. It's not going to affect the sinosphere for very long. Any AI trick you can come up with, we can neutralize it, as we have just seen in the news in the past few months.
Derek, here's a question that I think will go to you. Quote, at least according to popular narrative, Sputnik spurred America to get much more serious about education. America's competition with China has spurred no comparable efforts to improve American education. Why not? And what would a comparable effort today look like? How do you respond?
I really love the person who asked this question. Thank you. It's because we're not actually competing. We're pretending to compete. I have an article out in National Review this week that says, why don't we know what American money supports in China? I didn't say to restrict it. I said, we don't even know. We don't know where our money goes to support our rival, our enemy, our possible war opponent, the country that steals our jobs, however you want to characterize it. So we have not, the reason is, I think, I wasn't alive then, but I think we took our competition, our rivalry, our enmity with the Soviet Union fairly seriously. We absolutely do not take the rivalry with China seriously. We continue to provide China with money and technology that it would take them much longer to develop on their own, and we try to speed them up. And it's not much of a rivalry when you push your competitor to go faster. So that's why we haven't responded, because talk aside, we don't have policies that say we don't have economic policies that say we're in a real competition with China. What would it look like? I can't answer what it would look like on the education side. It would look like we would stop helping them, which means there is going to be much more monitoring of US-China cooperation for, is this in our interest, or is it in the interest of the particular US entity? I'll just pick one, NVIDIA, to provide China and be very lucrative and help the NASDAQ, and has effects on the American economy. But it's probably not a good thing that NVIDIA has helped China use better chips than it could have developed on its own. and has skirted U.S. enforcement and so on. So I'll leave the education question to everyone else here who knows a lot more about it. But it would change American policy considerably if we were to take China seriously as a challenge. And it would be, for example, good for some American manufacturer workers and bad for American shareholders of tech stocks, just to illustrate.
So buried in the Higher Education Act of 1965 is Section 117, which again, this is sort of like really deep in the weeds. And according to that requirement of the HEA, every university that receives $250,000 or more in gifts or contracts from foreign countries need to report that number. Okay, so in Trump 1, 19 cases were opened by the Department of Justice in collaboration with the Department of Education, and they documented the flow of money to these universities. So it turns out that China was more strategic in its use and supported the money that China sent into the US has supported something like 6,000 articles that co-authored with Chinese scholars. And these are ones that are focused on things that matter to the defense of the country. So they're right. I mean, we've been paying our competitors. By the way, so of the 19 cases that were filed, Trump, these are rough numbers, but I think they're in the right ballpark. 9 of them were cleared during Trump's administration. 10 were carried over to Biden, and not one of them were closed. One was closed a few months ago. So the Biden administration didn't care about this at all, and clearly the amount of money that's being reported and disclosed, which is a legal obligation, is not being followed. So the country with the biggest investments in the U.S. Higher education is not China, but it is Qatar, by far. So I mean, the relationship the U.S. has with Qatar is complicated, shall we say? And following, so it's Qatar, China, and Saudi Arabia. That's it. What I'm hoping is that under Trump 2, that the monitoring of this will move from the Federal Student Aid Office, which couldn't even manage the FAFSA, to back into the office of the General Counsel's office, and they will work with the Department of Justice to actually enforce this reporting.
Nick, we're out of time here. I want to give you the last word, but I want to precede it by the penultimate word from an OECD report, which states students in Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang outperform their peers in other high-performing countries in all 3 PISA domains by a large margin. And then they say the excellence of student cognitive outcomes in BSJZ, China, can be attributed to teacher and school characteristics to a large degree. How would you close us out in that context?
To a large degree.
All right.
Yes, I mean, I think it's been an excellent discussion. Thank you for organizing this, Nat, Mark, Harry, Derek. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot.
Thank you all, and thanks all who watched this, and that's a wrap.